Well, welcome everybody to Hydroterra's last webinar for 2024. Today we're joined by Greg Hoxley, Principal Hydrogeologist and Technical Director from Jacobs, to talk about the rising significance of groundwater assessment and baseline monitoring in securing project approvals. Before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we conduct our work across this great land, and for that privilege we would like to thank the traditional owners. Hydroterra respectfully acknowledges the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where we are located today, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. There's a picture of our speaker. Thanks very much, Greg, for presenting today.
You're welcome.
A little bit about Greg. Greg Hoxley is a Senior Principal Hydrogeologist and Technical Director with Jacobs, based in the Melbourne office. He has over 30 years of experience, nearly 40 in fact, in groundwater investigations, natural resources, water management, landscape management issues, contamination, groundwater modelling and site evaluations. He has performed technical reviews for CSIRO, presented submissions to parliamentary inquiries and participates in the broader debate on water policy and management. So where did Greg Hoxley come from? So Greg originally studied geology at Melbourne University and very quickly discovered a passion for hydrogeology. So he commenced his career at the Rural Water Commission, and then that later got privatised, and that's when Greg entered consultancy for a company which was called SKM. I think SKM ultimately has continued through to be Jacobs today. So he's had over 40 years, or nearly 40 years, sorry, of consulting in this area. We're really lucky to have someone with such a depth of experience. And recently, Greg's been focused particularly on a lot of expert witness work associated with difficult project approvals. And today's presentation is a bit about really looking at how groundwater is becoming a more important element in those approval processes. We love your questions. Got lots of people here today. We want to share knowledge. Really appreciate your questions. So please use the Q&A button at the top of the screen, and we will read your questions out at the end of the presentation. Greg's got a hard deadline here of 1:30, so normally we have a crazy overrun to 2 o'clock on the Q&A, but today we will do our best to get through those. So please log your questions early on, and we'll start that Q&A early in the piece today. Why does Hydroterra do these webinars? Well, we are passionate about sharing knowledge, and to do that, we like to facilitate education through courses and webinars and that sort of thing. And we like to take an industry leadership position. So without further ado, I will hand over to Greg. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. Thanks for the invitation to be here, and welcome everybody. Thanks for the introduction as well. If you want to move to the next slide, please, Richard. I just basically want to give a bit of an introduction to what I'm talking about today and why. So this is a practitioner's perspective on what the expectations are for baseline groundwater assessments and how they feed into project approvals. I'm trying to give an overview of a number of different things that I see in a number of different projects. So one of the things about the talk I'm going to give today is I don't actually name any projects. I don't have any examples or pictures from particular sites or anything, because I wanted to keep this a bit abstract. I don't want to try and point a finger or make a comment about a particular project or a particular area that we're working on, but just to talk about some of the general rules and directions that I'm seeing in the industry. And so as a result, it's not really an official approach or any agency requirement. I'm not proposing in any way here that this represents a view or a guidelines of any particular approval agency, but I'm working over the years with most of them around the country. And so there's a lot of similarities, and I'm drawing the threads out from that work that the sorts of combining or continuous themes that are going through there. There are definitely some trends that I'm seeing in the industry at the moment, and through involvement in hearings and project approval processes, there's a number of repeating things that are coming out. And basically what I wanted to do is to draw your attention to these. For anyone who's in the audience who's a really deep hydrogeologist, then maybe what I'm going to say might be well known to you or considered. But because groundwater is a bit of a specialist topic and not everybody runs across it or people get into it in different depths, I wanted to give some of those perspectives as on today as we go through. So a couple of different things that I wanted to talk about. What are the different approval pathways, or when might you need to get approval for groundwater type of work? I'm going to talk about taken use type of applications, about groundwater impacts or effects. So that's your EES or EIS. And also pause a little bit to talk about the particular role of hearings, panels, and reviews when they come in for an application. Then to talk more specifically about groundwater monitoring, what are we looking at when we're trying to monitor or describe groundwater flow, groundwater quality, got some commentary about the length of record or frequency of monitoring that you need. I want to talk a little bit about the aquifer as a receptor in its own right, and a little bit about how you understand the threatening processes that are going to affect groundwater. And along the way, I've got some sort of general rules or trends that I'm seeing for people to be aware of. As we go through, might pause partway through some of the ones so that we can answer some of the questions or the QA. Richard, I think you're going to curate the Q&A, and where you see something that's relevant to a theme that I'm discussing at the time, we can probably take and have a bit of a conversation as we're going along.
Yep,
I don't have a large number of slides, so we're certainly going to have time for discussion and get a bit of a conversation going backwards and forwards. So generally, also a bit of a context about the interest in groundwater. You know, groundwater and hydrogeology has been studied for a long time. Most of that time, it's really been of interest to professionals. So scientists and engineers who are involved largely around water supply. So a lot of stuff in Europe about water supply from springs and aquifers, moving more into the other parts of the world. But it was a fairly niche area. You go out into a party or a barbecue on the weekend and people ask you what you do. If you say you're a hydrogeologist, you usually come back with a bit of a blank stare about what does that mean. But that's starting to change. And there's been some stuff in the public, in the media, and a few movies that have brought groundwater interest in. But we're also starting to see a lot more interest in the general public about how groundwater is important in the water cycle, in our environment, and what we need to do to manage it. Particularly in Australia, groundwater effects have been the focus of legal and regulatory interests for particularly large coal mines, a lot of the coal seam gas developments, and often similar large projects, say some of the large iron ore mines that are in the northwest of the country. So as they become a focus, you get people both wanting to do these projects, and you get people who are concerned about those projects or concerned about their effects. The question's coming up more and more, but what about the groundwater? So we have a situation where, particularly through the Commonwealth EPBC Act and what's called the water trigger, that larger projects, and particularly anything that involves coal or coal seam gas, is now got special attention through what's called the water trigger, and the water trigger through the EPBC Act. That means that there's a lot of really significant interest in whether or not a project triggers the so-called water trigger. One thing we know about people when you get involved in looking at groundwater in detail is that groundwater is inherently difficult to observe. So unlike going out and looking at, for example, vegetation mapping across an area or looking for significant species such as koalas or Regent parrot or something like that, don't have the advantage of being able to wander out and just see the groundwater. You have to put a lot of effort into it. And so we end up with a degree of uncertainty about groundwater characterization. In the industry, there's been a lot of conversation about uncertainty in our prediction tools, and there's a groundwater modeling initiative that's trying to look at characterizing uncertainty within groundwater models. But the other side of that uncertainty is that in some cases, it's pretty easy to pick holes in a groundwater characterization, particularly if you have a project that doesn't have a large budget, or you've got something where it's particularly contentious. More and more of what we've seen is that groups who have a particular interest in the project are trying to target in on the groundwater characterization and trying to use that to show that there's uncertainty about a project's effects, and using that uncertainty to cast doubt on the understanding of the project. This is really challenging from a groundwater point of view because the cost and effort involved in comprehensively showing the groundwater conditions is really significant. And what that leads to more and more through these hearings and application processes is that the standard or expectation of the amount of information that you'll have to be able to understand the groundwater is increasing and increasing. With every challenge, with every discussion about what we know about groundwater, the expectation is that the next one will do at least that, if not more. And so with that underlying expectation that people are looking at groundwater as potentially a poorly understood part of a project, we need to be really careful about how we're describing what the groundwater information is or the basis of the site. And that's sort of the point of the observations here, is to say that things have changed and they will continue to change. Thanks, Richard. So let's have a look at the types of applications or assessment that you might need to look at for what's called a take and use. One type of groundwater project is where you need to use groundwater. And typically there's a legal definition or difference between the taking of the groundwater and how you use the groundwater. But in the past, the process might be that, oh, I would like to use groundwater. I make an application to the relevant authority. The relevant authority says, that looks fine, go and do this. That's not where we are today. Applications for take and use of any significance really have to look at their effect on the surrounding area. You need to be looking at the effects on other users. You need to be looking at the effects on surface-based receptors, and particularly surface water. There are a lot of rules and requirements around the groundwater take, or what the effect of a bore is, or effect of a well on surface water. And we need to look at effects on the aquifer itself. And I'll come back to some of these, what these effects might look like later on. But the aquifer is also an environmental feature that needs to be protected, not just the other receptors that are out there. So typically, water licensing authorities have quite specific guidelines for what they're going to look at, often based around the drawdown or groundwater lowering effect at the nearest user or the nearest surface water body. The trends we're seeing at the moment more and more for taking uses and licenses is really consider the effect on water bodies. What's behind this is that we know from climate change trends that we've got that our surface water systems are drying up. Groundwater is often a key supporting component of those surface water systems. So any effect that's going to take more water out of the surface environment is going to magnify the overall climate change effects that we've got. So water bodies and groundwater connected vegetation, what's called groundwater dependent ecosystems, are really important things to consider about the effects when you're looking like you're going to take groundwater. As a side note, when I've got a question there about GDE or not, this is a major topic that we don't have time to get into in a lot of detail today, but the name groundwater dependent ecosystem is potentially a little bit misleading in that the issue of dependency is not so much of the test anymore. if you have vegetation that may be connected to groundwater, whether or not it's truly dependent on it, often what happens is we're deeming that there's a dependency there. It's really complicated to show whether or not a dependency is actually there or not. You need all sorts of understanding of the vegetation types, of the use patterns. So basically, if you have vegetation that you think has root mass that is anywhere near groundwater, the presumption is that it's groundwater dependent and has to be treated as such. So if you're looking at a take and use license, you're not only worried about, am I going to affect my neighbour? Am I going to affect the stream? But am I going to affect the landscape more broadly? You need to have an understanding of what those effects might be. And often, to do that, you will need to have an appreciation of what the groundwater is in that area. We are seeing more and more in the trend that the onus is on the applicant to demonstrate the acceptability of the impacts. And in a circumstance where there isn't a lot of other monitoring information, so if you don't have a user or somebody nearby that has information about the behaviour of the aquifer, more and more we're looking to applicants to actually provide that as part of their application process. So not only testing the bore that you want to take water from, but actually have some type of monitoring observation system. This is a significant shift from where things might have been, say, 10 years ago. So at the moment, the trend is monitor the groundwater for the effect that you've got. I think this is actually a good idea on another side, that if you're an applicant, oh, hello, Richard, we just lost the slides, I think. Or did I drop out? No, I'm there. Looks like we've lost Hydroterra. Still got 100 people. Somebody want to put a message in the chat just to show that I haven't lost everybody, because I suddenly just lost the screen. Excellent, thank you. I can see some raised hands going up. I'm going to continue while Richard and the team get their stuff back together again. So one of the things that you would want as a proponent is you need to be able to show what your effect has been. So you don't necessarily want somebody else coming along and saying, hey, you've had this effect, and you're going, I don't know whether I've had this effect or not. So part of the monitoring here is looking for groundwater behaviour in response to your pumping and being able to show what that is objectively. Now, I'm just going to try and grab this back up again so I can potentially put the slides up. See if I can share. Well, sorry, we seem to have completely lost the Hydroterra team. Bear with me for half a tick. I'll get this up. All right, here we go. Righto, folks, we back on. Can I again, oh, sorry, go back into here. Again, could I have a hand or a comment from one of the participants? Thank you. Just to show that you can see the slides. Excellent. Oh, let's get into here. So, groundwater take and use. So the other groundwater effect that you might want to have a look at is that if effects or impacts on volume or flow. So this is different from where you might be taking water from an aquifer. Ah, Richard, you're back. Welcome. Do you want to put the slideshow back up, Richard, or would you like me to continue?
I'll put the slide back up.
Okay, I'll stop my share and keep going. We lost you for a while.
Yes, sorry, the whole Hydroterra internet has gone down. Actually, leave yours up, I think.
Right, I'll go back to sharing. Apologies, folks, on the call. This is one of these wonderful glitches that you get. I'll go back in here. Righto. Back into this one. So this is the sort of thing where you might be doing something that's going to have an effect on groundwater. So that's other than your take and use. So that could include a recharge effect. You're putting water into the ground. Aquifer storage and recovery or managed aquifer recharge are examples where you're going to affect groundwater, but not by taking it, but by potentially adding to it. A big one that we're seeing a lot of interest in at the moment is around infiltration. So that's wastewater lagoons, new lakes, new ponds, dams, water storing features. Also, if you're an irrigator and you're irrigating with something that may affect the groundwater quality or the groundwater condition underneath it, you do also need to consider that. So where this comes in very commonly is if you're running part of a water authority, for example, and you're running a wastewater treatment plant and you have disposal of effluent to land, more and more we're seeing that the effect of that on the groundwater is something that has to be monitored and reported on. And more than that, you have to really understand the nature of your impact. Another one here, which is a bit of an interesting one that people wouldn't think about very often, but change in land use or land cover. So broad spread clearing of vegetation or a change in land use or the addition of, say, a forest or other vegetation can have a significant effect on the groundwater from a flow or volume perspective, and would also need potentially some level of approval because of its effect on groundwater. You need to identify the records that sort of demonstrate this change. So the trend here in the applications is that groundwater monitoring is increasingly expected to demonstrate what these changes are in the key groundwater processes. So you need a baseline. You need to understand what's going on. Previously, what we might have had would have been collect some background data, put it into a model, and then project what those changes are. Because of the issue with models and model uncertainty and the challenges of being able to show that precisely, we are seeing a trend where actual results on the ground, pilot studies, effects of similar actions in nearby environments are becoming increasingly as important as your modeled or forecast component. So if you're looking at something that is likely to have an effect and you can find either a small part of the site and that you can show what is going on, having groundwater monitoring or baseline information about that type of change in the condition that you're in, rather than relying only on modelling, is a really valuable thing to do.
So Greg,
Yep.
just from a practicality of, applying to get a project up, takes a long time to get the proof of the dynamics. I mean, you've got seasonality, you've got all those
Yes.
things.
Yeah, so creating a bit of a conundrum here, Richard. So that's really good.
I would have thought it's pretty hard for
I'm sorry, your signal's breaking up. I think you're hotspotting on your mobile and we're losing a bit of your audio there, Richard.
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yes, come back. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, just the longevity of collecting monitoring data to prove up that case, that was always why we did do modeling. Has the mood around modeling changed to the point of impact forecast? Has it sort of got to that point, or can we rely on it?
Yeah, so look, this is a personal view on it. There is a wide variety of views in our industry. I think that there's generally developed a bit of a suspicion of models at the moment. I think one of the challenges that's come up with the work that's been looked about characterizing model uncertainty is that in many cases where you end up with is that you're recognizing that you've got a fair amount of uncertainty. And I've found that regulators and decision makers often have difficulty understanding what to do with the uncertainty that a model might present them. Whereas if you've got some information that shows how the groundwater is behaving at the site you're really interested in, and that's coming from actual observation, that's a really powerful explanation or demonstration of what we think is going on. And more we're seeing that that's really valuable and provides comfort to people and decision makers in particular that we understand what the site is doing. And to your point about the length of time, I've actually got some slides coming up a little later on where I talk about the length of time that you might need and how long it might need to go for. So I just hold that question and we'll come back and maybe revisit that after the next session in some of the later slides. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the roles of hearings and panels and courts. Any significant project is going to get caught up in some type of hearing, public hearing process. Even a simple take and use license has in most jurisdictions has an appeal period or an appeal process. And people more and more are raising concerns about these that lead to the need for some type of review, and whether it's a committee or whether it's an administrative review. These take on a really great added level of scrutiny and detail. When you get into a hearing, or particularly if it's a court, but even if it's a panel hearing, it can get quite abstract. Many projects that are sort of regarded as reasonable when you review a document, when you get into the public hearing stage, because of the intense scrutiny that's put on every little element of it, they can fall over at the public hearing stage because of 2 or 3 little details. Now, refer back to the comment that I made before that for some people who are opposed to a project, creating this level of doubt around small factors is actually part of the process. Now, in one sense, it's good to have that out there because it gets seen in the public opinion. And I'm not arguing against this. I'm just saying that if you're dealing with groundwater, these are really challenging observations because it is difficult and it takes time to get the information that you need to be able to show that. So lack of clarity about your groundwater currents behaviour can be a major contributor to doubt about a project. But once a hearing is scheduled, it's usually too late to collect the individual data. So my advice to you, or the trend that I'm seeing here, is that you really need quite strong levels of understanding of groundwater behaviour, solid evidence of site condition, and it's really valuable when you get into those hearing processes. So if you're involved in something that you think may go through a challenge or a hearing or an appeal, consider starting really early with your groundwater. Groundwater stuff is a long lead time item. And it's really difficult to think, oh, maybe I don't need to spend that money. Maybe I can put it off to later and pick it up later on the program. That's actually really problematic when it comes to groundwater and groundwater monitoring. So be aware of that. I've been in a number of hearings over the last couple of years where opinion on the matter of the project has rested on 3 or 4 quite small observations. And it's quite difficult to deal with those. So what do you need to characterize? So I've talked about the types of applications as sort of things
Just
that you do.
Greg.
Yeah. Sorry, Richard.
Sorry. And apologies for my internet connect. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. I was just thinking about a project that we've been involved in where the approved way of disposing of groundwater was to transpire it through a plantation. Okay, so going to your point about measuring rather than modelling, one would need to establish the plantation first to know whether or not it was going to be effective for that use, or we're dependent on modelling. Just sort of
look. I think what I'm saying is that both are important. You need a forecast. You have to be able to form a basis of where you think things might go. But if you don't have actual observations about the performance of your tree lot, for example, and you're relying on an expectation of said, well, we've modelled what we think is going on, that's increasingly starting to be difficult and not enough proof. So I guess the response to that is get your monitoring in at the same time of the plantation and be prepared to defend or adapt and understand what your effect is and know what it is rather than having somebody else tell you what they think it is. Because one of the challenges, if you're relying solely on the model forecast and you don't have some type of verification on the ground, is that if you have somebody who has a very firmly held opinion about what's going on, unless you've got more than modeled evidence about what's happening, you're in a very awkward position. And the weight of the opinion about what's going on can be, really strong. And in the end, whether or not a model gets accepted comes down to that view about people's opinions on it, which is increasingly getting more and more difficult to prove at a high level. You can get peer reviews done. I don't want to turn this into a conversation about modeling. Modeling is really useful and important for understanding where you might end up and what the risks are. But being able to show what's actually happened, measured it, we looked at it, we've got enough information about it. That's also really powerful, particularly if you get questions about what the impact has been. So groundwater flow. You need sufficient groundwater monitoring sites to be able to characterize a bunch of things. You need to know your pressure gradient. So, classic sense, what's the horizontal flow? What's the groundwater contours? What's the flow field? Where are you going? But you need to do that vertically as well as horizontally. So you obviously have to have an understanding of the site conceptualization. You need to know where your aquifers are, and you need to know about the potential for inter-aquifer flow. You need to understand broadly the recharge and discharge areas. And by that, I'm saying in the context of the site or the area that you're looking at, where is the groundwater coming from? What's driving it? Where is it going to? How is that being driven? How will your site define or change that flow field and flow condition? And particularly vertically, we need to understand inter-aquifer flow. Have we got the potential for leakage into other areas? This will usually mean at least 5 wells in the main aquifer of interest. Now, if you go out and look at some of the guidelines, some of the older ones, you might see that theoretically you need 3 wells to do a gradient. Yeah. Yes. But from what I'm seeing with the level of change and information about that, is that we need more than that now. And I think for most sites, you need at least 5 wells to cover the main aquifer of interest to be really clear that you've defined the interactions around the site. 3 or so of those, 3 or 4 can be on-site. Having an off-site well that represents the off-site conditions is also a really useful thing to do if you can do that. And I recognise in some cases, because of land ownership and tenure, it's not possible to do that. Coming back to Richard's question before, this monitoring record, you need to cover a fully representative seasonal cycle. Typically in groundwater through most of Australia, that's going to be 1 year. But you might need 2 or 3 years if you've got unusual conditions. Now, in a lot of cases, have a look at the project record that we've got for how long it takes to get many of our larger projects up. It will often take a couple of years to get through an approvals process. So you do have the time, if you get in early, to be able to cover multiple seasons. Having only 3 months or 6 months of groundwater data about the aquifer performance is going to contribute significant uncertainty to your understanding of it. And I think you need to plan to have a full seasonal cycle. If it turns out it's a really bad year, like it was really wet or it was really dry or somehow abnormal, you might need to go longer than that. Your hydrogeological conceptual model has to support your well locations and depths. You need to cover up gradient monitoring, a couple of bores. You need a cross and down gradient inside, the 3 bores inside, ideally down gradient outside of the site and a couple of bores. You need to be looking where the nearest stress points are that are not related to the project. So if you're doing something over here and there's either a groundwater user or somebody else who's affecting groundwater nearby, it might be a river, it might be a wetland, it might be a lake, having some other information in the vicinity of that stress point is also quite useful. The onus here is on the applicant to demonstrate that that 3D flow field is understood and the effects of it have been considered. And if you don't have that information when you first start a project, you are going to need to collect it because it's going to be difficult for people to accept any type of realistic effect or significant effect unless you know that. I want to talk now about groundwater quality. And just noting that this is a really complex topic and groundwater quality studies are worth a seminar pretty much in its own right. But the thing is that some of the things you need to be aware of is what is your background groundwater quality in the context of the site? And then maybe what is the ambient quality at the site or around it? And we get into this situation because we might have a broad understanding of what the groundwater is within a region, but that is quite variable. And when you get to your particular site, you might have a different condition at the site from what you've got regionally. It might be better quality or it might be worse quality. You need to be able to describe both the site and the regional context. You need to be in control of the elements and the analytes that you use to define that. Ideally, your wells need to be in the right spot in line with the hydrogeological model, your conceptual model, so that you're not relying on where somebody else wanted to put a well for some other different purpose. So you want to be sampling from the region of interest. You want to be sampling off the site. You want to know absolutely about your site. And you want to have some indication of what is around that background quality. So you need to show the ranges of the water quality over a few cycles. So for each receptor, you also want to understand the groundwater quality tolerance. A single groundwater sample is going to be difficult to show how the range of quality may vary. For the parameters, well, the only thing I can say here is, consider those potential contaminants of concern, or what are those processes within your project that might lead to a change in the groundwater, and target your parameter set to pick up on those items. Be really clear about how they exist across the aquifer. Guideline values are of limited help in most sites. Where people end up in a lot of cases is going to the ANZAC guidelines, Australian Water Quality Guidelines. It then comes down to, well, what are the standards that we want to use? In this sense, for example, if you're in Victoria and you're looking at the EPA guides around the segments of groundwater, they are really something to get you started. You actually need to know what your site is, because you've got that duty overall of protecting groundwater wherever it is, regardless of what you think the regional quality is. It's not good enough anymore to say, oh, the average water quality across this area is this. We're going to pull in this guideline and manage it. If you have a pocket that's slightly better than that, you do need to understand and show that you're responding to, protecting, preserving, looking after the quality pocket of better quality water that you might have within your overall site. So while there are guideline values, and they're quite good when you get into surface water ecosystems, or where you're looking at a particular use or particular receptor, often you'll need to come up with your own guideline value. So more and more the trend at the moment is for a major project, you need to look at the guideline that is relevant for the contaminants or parameters that are associated with your project in the project context. And to do that, you need wells and you need groundwater samples, and you need them from your area. So this trend here is on the applicant to demonstrate the site and the surrounding context through deliberate testing. Published records, general views of the aquifer, statements of segments, maps of water quality, a great place to start, but are probably not going to be good enough in the end, particularly if you have a high-profile project. The other thing here about the length of record is you need sufficient monitoring to be able to define the range of natural variability. Also think about the extent of other users and projects. What's the likely trend in the system given all the other things that are going on? You want to demonstrate seasonal variability. In a lot of cases, tidal response if you're close to the coast. Surface water interaction, river level fluctuations, flooding periods. Flooding is important for groundwater in many areas. So I think the records need to be at least over a year. They probably want to demonstrate a cycle of use. So if you've got an irrigation season or irrigation pumping that's going on, or some other process cycle, like you've got an industrial process that's got a cycle or pattern of behavior, you want to try and cover that cycle with your monitoring. not assuming at the moment. So the trend in applications and assessments is groundwater is not assumed to be stable. Climate changes and anthropogenic factors are leading to trends in groundwater. We need to be able to define what those trends are and overprint them and forecast them. And that's best made on the basis of data from the site. So coming back to the frequency, picking up on some of that ideal, how often should I be monitoring groundwater from a level point of view? Because you need to characterize tides, rainfall effects, river interaction, flood effects, wetlands, pumping patterns. I think a good starting point is hourly level data. So I think in these days, you really do need to be logging the information at your site. There is a whole lot of other reasons why having high frequency groundwater data across the site is useful for a range of other purposes. That doesn't mean you have to track everything at an hourly basis. You might choose after having collected that for a while to say, you know what, we think that monthly records are going to adequately characterize the changes that we're seeing, but we've done it off a beginning stage of high frequency readings. I think that high frequency readings are increasingly important. You need to show that you don't need them before dismissing them. Up until relatively recently, the idea would have been to come in and do monthly readings in a lot of cases. But more and more people are asking, how do you know that monthly is good enough for the processes that you're looking at? I'd be suggesting that on your site, you want to start and look at logging of things probably hourly to begin with for a period of time, at least for a season, or so that you can show that you can change to another frequency. Now, be aware, I'm not talking here about chemistry information. Grabbing chemistry samples is a different thing, but you would inform your chemical sampling protocols off what you're getting from the groundwater level changes. And if you understand the response time of your system you're dealing with, you're much better off to justify why a particular groundwater chemical sampling regime is worthwhile. And finally, going to come through to some comments about the aquifer itself. You need to consider the effects on the aquifer of the project that you're looking at. A classic example of that is subsidence. Am I going to do something like with taking water out of the aquifer that's going to leave the aquifer collapse? And do I need to understand what that is and what the aquifer is doing? Also, though, more and more we're seeing this issue of maybe clogging or chemical alteration of the rock and sediments. So if you're looking at an aquifer storage and recovery scheme, or if you're looking at injecting or introducing water chemistry that is quite different from what's in the native chemistry, we could alter the porosity and the porosity values of the aquifer through some of these chemical interactions. So the trend here is that demonstrating an awareness of the aquifer structure and changes that your project might introduce into aquifer structure is becoming increasingly important. This is more of a geochemical type of alteration, but what we're wanting to see is some awareness that these things are possible, and if they're not likely, then showing that on the basis of some evidence.
So, Greg, there's no mention there around stygofauna. Is the biology of an aquifer not really important in the process? Or?
Oh, yes, but I guess in my mind, I'd sort of thought about that as a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So if you've got stygofauna that's dependent on the groundwater, I guess the point that I was trying to make here about the aquifer is the aquifer structure as an entity is important. You may very well have bugs floating around within your aquifer. They have to be dealt with or characterized as a GDE. So you need to be sampling and looking for those if you think that there's a chance that they will be there. They can be affected by aquifer structural changes as well as quality changes. So that's another reason to be looking at the aquifer, because your bugs might be affected by clogging, for example.
In your experience, is the presence of stygofauna pretty ubiquitous?
Oh, yeah, this is a really interesting topic. The more we look, the more we find in groundwater. However, in much of Australia, groundwater is fairly saline, and so you may have small amounts of it. But I think it's fair to say that wherever you have high quality groundwater, potentially anything in the drinking quality range, you're very likely to have stygofauna present in those areas. Now, then the question is, are they unique? That's a really interesting topic. The research that I've seen tends to suggest that the assemblages of stygofauna are quite local. And so there is a possibility that you could end up with a high quality aquifer that has an assemblage that's quite restricted and therefore potentially threatened by the activity that you're going on with. This is another reason for having highly detailed understanding of what you're going to do to the groundwater, so potentially you can describe what the effect of that on all sorts of GDEs, mostly vegetation, but also stygofauna. This is a rapidly developing area of interest, not one that we have a lot of history in most aquifers in Australia. So it's certainly one that's emerging very quickly.
The other one I had was relating to, you mentioned quite early on about groundwater dependent ecosystems and proving whether or not there is a connection or a dependency. And I guess I was just wondering, well, how do you really go about that? What are the lines of evidence that you need to have? Do you need to go to the point of showing evidence of capillary rise to the root zone? And
yeah, sap flow measurements, they're showing the water use potential, particularly sometimes you can do it from satellite information, looking at ET, and in vegetation type, you could look at ET use. One of the classic ways of doing it is to look, do we have vegetation that's growing actively at times when there's low rainfall? If it's doing that, then it's probably using groundwater. One of the challenges with that is it's often really difficult to separate out soil water storage from groundwater directly. So one of the questions is it using it from the aquifer or is it using a soil water reserves? Depending on how much effort you want to go to, it might be best just to assume that they're groundwater dependent and then show the effects on the groundwater. But in some cases, you may need to actually characterize what that dependence, the nature of that dependence, and how the quality or groundwater condition will affect the use for the particular species that you're interested in.
something that was burning in the back of my mind was some of these large coal seam gas projects that we've been involved in. The level of baseline data that was available at the start of those projects was negligible and then grew with substantial investment during the project. And it ran in parallel with the project. So the approval was sort of granted, I guess, with rules about must not impact to X level of, drawdown in adjacent aquifers and that side of things. Are those sorts of approaches still considered valid? Like, is it okay to set rules and if you do see an impact, stop? Or do you think, as the world said, well, no, prove it first? Because it's pretty hard to prove something like that up front.
Yeah, so I think it varies on the scale of the project, Richard. So I think at the moment, with the community interest in and generally large opposition to, say, new coal projects, I think it would be really problematic to assume that the approval processes that have run 10 years ago are going to be good enough now. I think there is an expectation that you will have a very high level of understanding of the effects of that type of project. Smaller, lower risk or smaller impact projects, no, I think it's quite fair to say we've got a reasonable expectation that there isn't going to be an effect, and so we will set a limit or some type of trigger, and it's the job to monitor and know whether or not you've met that trigger. One of the challenges for a proponent with that type of project is you want to be really clear that it's your project that's fixed that trigger or set something off. And I think that part of what I'm talking about here is building up that information to be able to make the case of your understanding Otherwise, there is a potential that you could be responding to things that are not solely the responsibility of the project. Also, while we've talked about adaptive management for 20 years or so now, more questions are being asked about if you take an adaptive management approach, how are you actually going to do that? What is the decision-making process that you're going to have? How will you adapt? What evidence will you use to adapt? What's the basis of that evidence? And this is where your understanding of the monitoring of the site prior to effect and then monitoring of effect are really going to come in to be able to say the cause and effect relationship is understood in this way, and therefore we are changing our operation in that way to avoid that effect. If you don't have that level of information, it's a much more difficult thing to do to get acceptance that the measures that you're taking are actually going to stop the problem that people are trying to come up with. There are many examples around the place at the moment of projects where impacts have been seen on nearby GDEs or surface water features that were not anticipated at the start of the project. Then untangling how you have to change the project so that you can fix that then becomes a really difficult exercise. So I see you put some questions up there, Richard. So
Yeah, do you want me to read them out and have a go?
I think they're up on the screen, so that they're okay. Where to place bores to monitor pollution in new landfalls? Well, hopefully I've given a bit of guidance about that. I think you need some on site, right next to your site. You need some off site nearby your receptors. You need something that's a bit up gradient, so a background bore, so you know what's coming into your site, and something that's downstream that's showing that the flow field's stable. So it's a part of the question here is how fast do you think that an escape from a landfill is actually going to go? So the one question of that is, let's say our liner or our control stay in place and are workable. That's one case. Another one is, what if we get a breach though? What happens if the liner or the control measure fails? How would I know, and where would I need to be looking for that to occur? What's our most sensitive area? And you'd be placing bores in areas that you think are more likely to show up a change, even if you had an unexpected outcome. So that's to talk of, say, 5 bores or more near receptors that are important in between the two in places that are likely to be hydrogeologically active.
Is there really any technical basis to saying 5?
Well, I think that you're ending up with more than the 3 that you need to characterize a slope and something that will give you a shape. So you've got more chance of being able to describe the shape and the character of the groundwater if you've got 5 bores. How can I say? It's more of a guideline than a rule.
Yeah.
If you're a hydrogeologist and you're working on a site, this is part of the art of providing that professional opinion, looking at all the circumstances. I guess I'm addressing my comments at people who might have a site and want to know, oh, I'm going to get some advice, but what should I be expecting? Well, if somebody comes back to you and tells us you've got to drill 5 or 8 wells, don't be surprised. I think this is where it's at. Exactly where they go, well, that's where you can get some good professional opinion to help you with it.
Yeah. Next question.
So there's one here about the Lake Leto area. I don't know that I know that site. So if someone wants to help me about whereabouts that would be, I could possibly give some context, but that might be a bit specific. Given that I don't know the site, I'm not really sure that I want to say too much about it, Richard. So I might just leave that one.
Yes. Groundwater dewatering approval requirements for development approvals and
Drained
SSD.
basements, yeah. Look, I think I tried to address a bit of that in the front of the presentation where I was talking about take or use requirements. So if you have a drained basement, you're taking groundwater. This is where this subtle distinction between groundwater take versus where you take it to use it. What are the requirements? Well, you really do need to understand the effects you're having on your neighbours. how far is it going to propagate, where it's going to go. So I think I sort of tried to address that in the early slides about what are the sorts of things that you need to know. How will you be changing the variability of the groundwater? What are the receptors nearby? Drained basins in particular in Perth are a big issue because you've got that shallow sand aquifer at the surface and got the potential for quite a widespread effect of a drained basin. In some of the other sites, around Sydney, maybe most of Melbourne, you have much, lower permeability material, and so the drained basements are less of a broad scale issue there. But you've got to be able to characterise where do you think it's going to go, how do you think it's going to change the conditions for your neighbours and for receptors. I think in this case, you may well need a number of bores at those receptors to understand what's going on, to be showing what your effect is. Now, fitting them into a tight urban environment, that's sometimes really challenging. I'm not at all underestimating that problem. But also, probably what you don't want to do is have a neighbour say to you, oh, your basement did that, and be left in the circumstance where I've got no idea because I've got no monitoring.
So just your comment earlier about adaptive management, and that there's more emphasis coming on to say, well, okay, it's one thing to say that, but what do you actually do? Do you think that's where it's all going? It's like, because it's not really practical to get enough long-term monitoring at the front end, they'll have to do more monitoring of their operational performance and have hard and fast rules on adaptive management.
Yeah, look, I think people are more and more expected to be able to adapt. I think the trend where they're seeing at the moment is to talk about the expectations and obligations of a proponent. So what I'm seeing more is that the idea that government will give you a license and you can just do whatever you like, provided you comply with that license. I think those days, if not gone, will be very soon gone. So you won't get a license to pollute. You won't get an ability to just do something and just keep going forever, regardless of the consequences. You're seeing more and more conditions, more and more performance criteria being put on your approvals. And it's leading to the state that in order to be able to be sure that you can meet those performance criteria, you're going to have to be able to adapt your operation based on what actually occurs. To do that, you're going to need information about the effect that your site is having on the surrounding groundwater system. And to do that, you're going to need monitoring data.
Right, we're running out of time, so I'll go to the next question. Reliable data requires continuous and long-term monitoring. That's music to my ears. Would this be a challenge?
Absolutely. Where's the balance? How much is enough? If you have a really strongly opposing group who are demanding high levels of certainty, or you have a high-value receptor that needs to be protected, yeah, you sometimes don't have a lot of choice but to be able to collect the information to be able to say that. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can show that there is such an unlikely chance of something being affected that you don't need to be able to have great periods of time record. If something is essentially disconnected in a groundwater sense from the operation or what you're doing, then you may be able to have a shorter period of record. You are still, however, going to need enough information to be able to show that that assessment of disconnection is actually a valid one. And so more and more, yes, I'm seeing that collecting this type of record. There's another whole topic after this, Richard, about how do you store it? Where do you put it? If we've got all these groups out there that are collecting groundwater data, but they're all held tightly within their organisations, we're probably as a society not making best use of that. So how might we share all of this project data that's being collected and make it available for others? I think is a really interesting topic potentially, and obviously for another day. We're not going to go into it today.
I think a great example of it working well is that Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment in Queensland, where all those coal seam gas sites have come together, and it looks to me like pretty much real-time contouring, etc., and some great reporting that comes out regularly. So it's doable.
It is doable. It's taken a lot of effort to get that set up, though.
Oh, and huge amounts of money. I
Yes.
suppose that's the other thing. There's one question in the Q&A. Are we okay, Greg, or you've got to jump?
I can do one more.
One more, okay. Hopefully it's a good one. Just a comment. The IESC information guidelines for proponents preparing coal seam gas and large coal mining development proposals, February 2024, talks to a minimum of 2 years of baseline data prior to development commencing, and it would be desirable to have 10 years or more of baseline data.
Yep. So this is an example of the trend that we're seeing. So if you're running a coal project, because of the community concern about those, this is where you're at. You now need at least 2, possibly more. I think that's going to start to set the tone for other projects. So we don't require 2 if you want to put in like a wastewater disposal scheme to land. At the moment, there isn't a requirement of 2. My suggestion is you need a year. And I think you need to answer that question about what is the seasonality and see it through a cycle before you can be clear about what the effects might be. No, but this is coming at us. More and more of those types of requirements trickle down. And what you see in those bigger, higher risk projects over time start to become the norm or the expectation. So I think that's a great comment, because that's showing where is the really high risk focus at. Well, that's quite significant. Do I need to collect 10 years of data before I can run a project? Well, we're getting to the point with some of them you might.
You think we're out of step versus requirements required of proponents overseas, or do you think this is a global?
No, that's a really difficult question, because if you were to go into somewhere like let's say Vietnam or other places, then society expectation about the value of the environment and the risks that you take is completely different to what we have in Australia. I think these requirements come out of the expectation of our society about how we will look after our environment. They're not out of step of the broad society. I think the question that's coming at us, though, is will the end consumers really want to pay for the cost of their goods and services if they're embedding all of these costs in it? I think there's a bit of a view at the moment that someone else will pay. So it'll be interesting to see if society mood shift. Right at the moment, no, I think these regulations are responding to the expectations of our society about the way that we're going to look after our environment. So I don't think they're out of step. I think they're at that. This is where our community this is what our community wants at the moment.
It's interesting, isn't it? You've got the GED, which is also going down that same path. There's some good positive improvements, I think. Peter Gandy, just to sneak one in, said, can we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to assist in this groundwater management?
Of course, we can use it to assist. How much is it actually going to be reliable in a sparse data environment? These large models are only as good as the training set that you use on it. And one of the real challenges of hydrogeology has always been how to infer a response from a very limited data set. As we get more data, we'll be able to train some of these models on them. I think it'll be a while. Machine learning, definitely. Algorithms for projections, definitely. Large language models and AI to answer groundwater problems, might be a while, in my view. Might be a while.
All right, Greg. Well,
thank you for that.
Ready for your next meeting. Many thanks for presenting today. Apologies for my internet, but you actually handled that very calmly. So excellent work there, and really appreciate your time. And thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, no problems. Thank you all. And yeah, have a great end of the year, everybody.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.